November 1979. Tehran, the beginning of one of the boldest diplomatic crises of modern times. The world had barely begun to process the revolutionary changes in Iran when a dramatic scene unfolded in the heart of Tehran. Something out of a spy thriller. A group of young, radical individuals took control of the US Embassy. No warnings, no diplomatic talks. This wasn't a protest, it was a full-scale takeover. Inside the embassy were more than 50 American citizens. Their lives were in direct danger. Communication with the outside world was limited. The international response was cautious. Every word could be a match dropped into a barrel of gasoline. But amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. 6 employees, not high-ranking, with no bodyguards or special training, made a decision that would change their lives. They found a way out of the captured compound, not through the roof, not through secret tunnels. They simply disappeared, quietly, without a trace, without a single shot fired. This wasn't a Hollywood escape. It was pure instinct, a split-second reaction, and a belief that even the slimmest chance was worth taking. From that moment, they became invisible. In a city where every foreigner was under scrutiny, 6 people vanished from the map. They hadn't been caught by the hostage takers. But where did they go? How did they slip away unnoticed? Who would dare to shelter them, knowing the price that might come with it? This is where the nearly impossible game began, one that would later go down in history under the codename Argo. By November 1979, Iran had already been in a state of political upheaval for several months. Back in January, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the country's longtime ruler, fled abroad under pressure from massive protests. His regime, backed by the US, was associated in the minds of Iranians with repression, brutality, and Western interference. The Savak, his secret police, was especially feared for crushing any opposition. Amid this chaos, a figure returned from exile. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a religious leader who quickly became the face of popular anger. He led the Islamic Revolution, which within weeks radically transformed the nation, from a monarchy to a theocracy. Under his leadership, the Islamic Republic of Iran was born, a new form of government based not on elections or liberal values, but on a Shiite interpretation of Islamic law. Alongside this power shift came a surge in anti-Western sentiment. The US became the main target of hatred, not just as the Shah's former ally, but as a symbol of the corrupt and immoral West. In Tehran, angry crowds stormed embassies and burned flags. The revolutionary leadership mobilized youth into revolutionary committees, paramilitary groups tasked with rooting out enemies of Islam. This created a volatile environment where any Western presence, especially American, was seen not as diplomacy, but as hostile action. So when radicals stormed the US Embassy that November, it wasn't a shocking anomaly. It was the natural outcome of the revolution's fever pitch. After escaping the embassy, the 6 American diplomats found themselves in Tehran without cover or a plan. They couldn't appear in public, couldn't approach official channels, and returning to the embassy was out of the question. The city was tightly controlled, especially with regard to foreigners. They spent the first few hours on the move, avoiding crowds, not using phones, leaving no trace. Their appearance attracted attention. Their language gave away their origin. In such a setting, any contact with locals could be dangerous. They reached out to several other embassies for temporary shelter. Most declined, fearing political repercussions. Only Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor agreed to help. Alongside his wife, he made a decision not authorized by his government, but driven by a sense of personal responsibility. The Americans stayed in the ambassador's residence for nearly 3 months. They remained unseen, never appearing in windows, never stepping outside, never making a sound. Their presence was kept in strict secrecy. The risk of being discovered was constant. Even a neighbor or household staff member could pose a threat. During this time, their lives were reduced to basic routines, waiting for news, and limited communication. With each passing week, it became clear they couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed a safe, organized, and convincing way out of the country. The 6 American diplomats in hiding were Robert Anders, consular officer, Mark Liek, vice consul, Koroliak. His wife worked in the immigration department. Joseph Stafford, political officer. Kathleen Stafford. His wife worked in visa documentation. Lee Schatz, agricultural statistician with the Agency for International Development. When it became known that 6 American diplomats had avoided capture and were hiding in Tehran, the US government decided to keep this information absolutely secret. The reason was strategic. Acknowledging their escape publicly could endanger their lives and further complicate the already tense situation with the 52 hostages still held at the embassy. But there were serious risks. If it became known that others had escaped and were hiding, a massive manhunt could be launched. The Canadian residents sheltering them could come under pressure or even be raided. Any failed attempt to rescue them could result in major political fallout. The CIA was assigned the operation, specifically a division that specialized in identity fabrication, cover stories, and extractions from hostile territory. One of the agency's top experts in this field was Tony Mendes, a specialist in creating documents, cover identities, and exfiltration plans for agents or high-value individuals in danger zones. Mendes's mission was to quickly find a safe method of evacuation, create a cover story so convincing it could withstand close scrutiny, provide real documents, visas, background stories, and behavior training for all 6 individuals, coordinate fully with the Canadian government since Canadian identities were to be their official cover. Several other ideas were initially considered. Secret evacuation using UN supply trucks, using routes through other embassies, waiting for a better opportunity to blend in and escape disguised as local residents. But all of these options were either too slow or too risky. The US government could not guarantee safety with any of them. Mendes proposed the most unexpected, but technically feasible plan, to create a fake science fiction film crew supposedly in Iran, scouting locations for a movie. This cover would provide a logical reason for a group of foreigners to be in Tehran, a basis for carrying expensive equipment, passports, and tickets, a plausible explanation to leave the country legally via the airport, if the documents looked real enough. From there, Mendes began building a complete cinematic illusion, which would be given the codename Argo. In searching for a legal way to get the 6 Americans out of Iran through the main airport, Tony Mendes realized that the cover had to be more than believable. It had to be uninteresting, not raise any suspicion, and fit the local context. It needed to explain why foreigners were present in Tehran, be unusual enough to justify odd behavior, and yet plausible to Iranian authorities. That's how the idea of a movie production was born. Mendes's plan was to build an entirely fabricated story about a film crew arriving in Iran to scout for a major science fiction movie. He deliberately chose a genre that allowed for wild and flexible explanations, science fiction. And so, Argo was created, a movie that didn't exist but appeared to be gearing up for production. To make it convincing, they opened a real office in Hollywood. It was dressed to look like an authentic movie studio, furnished with desks, scripts, phones, promotional materials, and even staff to answer calls. They generated professional buzz, planted news about the movie's development, made up quotes from producers, and slick marketing presentations. Mendes knew that if anyone decided to verify the legitimacy of the project, they had to find traces of the film. And they did. There were mentions in the press, archives, posters, even phone directories. Everything looked authentic. The Argo script was written specifically for the mission. It was abstract enough to justify location scouting in the Middle East. That made it easy to explain why the crew was in Iran. The fictional film didn't need specific plot points, just exotic visuals, which Tehran's landscapes could easily provide. Each of the 6 was assigned a specific role. One was a screenwriter, another a cinematographer, a third a set designer, and so on. They were given full documentation packages, passports, business cards, production schedules, glossy brochures describing the project. Everything matched the level of a real Hollywood production. The key wasn't just creating the documents, it was training the people to use them, how to behave at customs, how to answer questions, how to carry themselves like film professionals. Mendes led a crash course, short but intense. By the time preparations were complete, the crew looked like a legitimate delegation from the movie industry. No political undertones, no signs of anxiety, just faces of people in Tehran to shoot a sci-fi film, planning to fly home in a few days. The primary objective had been achieved. The 6 Americans had become film crew members, on paper, visually, and psychologically. The next step was to make that legend work on the ground in Tehran. After weeks of preparation, Tony Mendes received authorization to enter Iran under a false identity, as a Canadian producer representing a studio interested in filming a science fiction movie in Iran. His cover was supported by official documents, pre-approved in coordination with Canadian authorities. In January 1980, Mendes arrived in Tehran as an ordinary foreign visitor. His arrival raised no suspicion. He carried clean paperwork, a real Canadian visa, and a backstory supported by published media about the film. Shortly after landing, he discreetly made contact with Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor. Through Taylor, a meeting was arranged with the 6 individuals needing evacuation. For safety, the meeting took place inside the ambassador's residence. No movement through the city, no outside observers. The first step was issuing each of the 6 their new documents: Canadian passports with false identities, business cards showing a studio name and position, e.g., visual effects director, assistant producer, production plans, brochures about the movie, locations, and budget airline tickets for a return flight scheduled in a few days. Then, Mendes conducted a detailed briefing. How to behave at the airport, what phrases to use when dealing with border officials, how to answer questions about the film, which parts of the story to emphasize and which to avoid. Each person received a simple cheat sheet with key details about their identity: biography, past projects, skills, industry terminology. The goal: to present themselves as calm, experienced, and legitimate professionals in Tehran for a short business trip. They also had to keep in mind the risks if the operation failed. If the cover was exposed and they were detained at the airport, it would mean increasing the number of Americans held in Iran, from 52 to 59. This would complicate ongoing negotiations for the release of the original hostages, place extra pressure on the US government, and could put the captives' lives in even greater danger. Canada's involvement was critical. If the operation were discovered, the Iranian government might retaliate against the Canadian embassy in Tehran. That could lead to its closure, the expulsion or arrest of Canadian diplomats, and a direct threat to their safety. One man would be particularly vulnerable: Ken Taylor, the ambassador at the center of it all. What might have happened to him remains a matter of speculation. Beyond that, the failure of the operation could have escalated tensions between Iran, the US, and Canada. At the time, diplomatic relations were already deeply strained. A further crisis could have led to a complete diplomatic breakdown or made any negotiations impossible. And if it became known that the operation was orchestrated by the Central Intelligence Agency, it would have caused a massive international scandal. Public exposure of the CIA's involvement could have triggered suspicion from other nations, cast doubt on the safety of diplomatic missions, and sparked a fresh wave of political accusations. At that time, anti-American sentiment in Iran was already at a boiling point. Over the following days, Mendes carefully assessed how prepared each person was. He simulated the types of questions they might face at the airport, observed their reactions, helped refine their answers, and corrected behaviors. At that time, Tehran was operating under heightened security measures. Airport checks were strict, especially for foreigners. But that's exactly why the film production cover worked. It appeared neutral enough to avoid drawing too much interest. Everything was ready for the final stage: the film crew's exit from the country through Tehran's international airport. It was a typical morning shift at the airport. Travelers arrived, checked in, and passed through security. Among them was a group of 7, 1 producer and 6 members of his film crew. They acted with confidence, didn't rush, spoke English with a light accent, showed their documents when asked, and answered questions clearly and succinctly. All of them held Canadian passports with properly issued visas. According to official records, they were film professionals who had spent a few days in Iran scouting for a science fiction movie. All names, job titles, and travel plans were coordinated in a way that withstood even closer inspection. There were a few tense moments at the checkpoints. One guard paused over the unfamiliar title, Art Director. Another looked at a visa longer than seemed necessary. But there was no reason for delay. Everything looked authentic, and the story held up thanks to the surrounding details. Psychological preparation played a crucial role. The diplomats didn't show fear, avoided looking suspicious, and behaved like seasoned travelers, either tourists or business people used to moving through international airports. Their demeanor matched what was written on their visa applications and in their background stories. There was also indirect support from Canadian diplomats, who were ready to quickly confirm the documents if any airport official tried to make a call for verification. After clearing all the formalities, the film crew made it to the departure lounge. When boarding was announced for the flight to Zurich, they walked onto the Swiss Air commercial plane, calmly, without drawing attention. Not a single guard, checkpoint officer, or airport staff member realized they had just witnessed a covert rescue mission. The plane took off. Only when it exited Iranian airspace did Mendes and the diplomats allow themselves their first real emotional response, a quiet exhale. They were free. Upon returning to the West, the 6 rescued diplomats were quickly placed under the care of the appropriate U.S. agencies. Their names didn't appear in headlines. There were no official statements, no interviews. The entire operation remained top secret, not only to protect those still being held hostage, but also because the mission's success heavily depended on the involvement of a third party, Canada. Officially, all the credit went to the Canadian government. The world heard that Canadian officials had helped American diplomats escape. The media dubbed it the Canadian Caper, and Ambassador Ken Taylor became a national hero. And it wasn't an exaggeration. His role had been absolutely critical. Even most government employees didn't know about the CIA's involvement or the true nature of Argo. The rescued diplomats stuck to the cover story in public. This level of secrecy was essential. Americans were still being held, the hostage crisis was ongoing, and international relations were extremely fragile. It wasn't until 1997, 17 years later, that the CIA officially declassified the documents confirming the true story behind the escape. Tony Mendes himself gave the first detailed public account, explaining the cover story, the fake film, and his trip to Tehran. The Argo operation became a prime example of thinking outside the box in a seemingly hopeless situation. And only then did the world learn that one of the most daring diplomatic rescues of the 20th century didn't rely on soldiers or weapons, but on a fake script, a non-existent movie, and an undercover performance without a stage. The remaining 52 hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, the day of President Ronald Reagan's inauguration. They had been held captive for 444 days. Their release came after intense negotiations, with Algeria serving as a mediator between the US and Iran. All 52 were brought to Germany for medical evaluations and later returned to the United States. None of the hostages were killed, but many suffered long-term psychological trauma, wounds that would last for years. After the materials were declassified in 1997, the story of the fake movie, the phony film crew, and the daring escape from Tehran began to gain public attention. What had remained hidden in classified intelligence files for years became a source of wide interest among journalists, historians, and screenwriters. For the first time, the event was seriously considered as a potential movie plot. In 2012, a dramatized adaptation of the story hit theaters, Argo, directed by Ben Affleck, who also starred in the lead role as Tony Mendes. The film was partially based on Mendes's own memoirs, as well as on an investigative article published in Wired magazine. The movie recreated the core events: the fictional film crew, the elaborate cover story, the journey to Tehran, and the tense escape through the airport. For dramatic effect, the film added fictionalized scenes, such as airport chases and last-second detentions, that didn't happen in real life. However, the film stayed true to the essence of the operation: its originality, creativity, and risk. Argo received widespread international acclaim and became one of the most talked about films of the year. At the 2013 Academy Awards, It won 3 Oscars, including the most prestigious Best Picture. It also won awards for film editing and adapted screenplay. Beyond its cinematic success, the film reignited global interest in the events of 1979 to 1980, highlighting the role of Canada, the courage of Ken Taylor, the ingenuity of Tony Mendes, and the extraordinary combination of diplomacy and imagination that saved lives.